"You have until tonight to understand this," I whispered, though no one heard. My children were gathered, smiling politely at her words, trusting what they shouldn't. I realized it was time to stop asking for respect and start claiming it before it was too late. I sat quietly in the corner of the living room, the heavy curtains drawing shadows across the furniture I had chosen, polished, and arranged over decades. The air was thick with polite conversation, a performance I had grown used to but never accepted. My daughter-in-law, poised and smiling, held the room as though it belonged entirely to her, while my own children hung on every word, blind to the subtle injustices woven between her sentences. Each nod they gave her, each laugh at her jokes, felt like another brick in the wall that had been slowly built around me. I remembered the day I first noticed the shift, years ago. The small things at first, a dismissive tone, a question ignored, a suggestion brushed aside. I had assumed it was harmless, that children sometimes followed new influences as they grew older. But over time, the neglect grew louder, the subtle erasures became undeniable. They didn't see me, not truly, not in the way that mattered. I had raised them, guided them, and sacrificed quietly for their lives, yet in my own home, I was becoming invisible. Her presence was magnetic, yes, but it was a charisma built on manipulation. I could see the little cues, the micro-expressions, the careful ways she steered conversations and decisions. The house that had once echoed with my voice now hummed with the resonance of her control. I felt a mixture of anger, sorrow, and determination settle deep into my bones. I would not be erased. I let my eyes wander around the room, taking in the photographs lining the walls, generations of memories, milestones, and celebrations that I had meticulously preserved. I saw myself in those frames, smiling, patient, ever present. And yet, the living present seemed intent on denying my place in the story. Each smile from my children was a reminder of how easily influence could cloud judgment. I realized that my fight would have to be quiet, calculated, deliberate. It could not rely on shouting or confrontation. It had to rely on the undeniable truth of my life, my sacrifices, and the evidence I had kept hidden. As the evening wore on, I listened to every word, every carefully constructed sentence, every subtle attempt to rewrite the narrative. I noted the moments where their attention wavered, where a hesitation betrayed uncertainty, and where I could begin to weave my own story back into the fabric of the household. I knew that tonight would be pivotal. This was not the moment for impulsive reactions, but for the patient application of strategy. Silence, I realized, could speak more than any confrontation. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, a reminder of the passage of time and the inevitability of action. My heart beat in measured cadence, echoing my determination. Each breath became a tool of composure, a signal to myself that I was ready to reclaim my voice. My children might not understand now, but the truth has a way of surfacing when it is needed most. I allowed a small smile, a glimmer of quiet confidence, to curve across my face. They could underestimate me all they wanted. It would be their mistake, not mine. As I rose from my chair to pour myself a cup of tea, I felt the familiar weight of years of patience and preparation settle into readiness. This evening was not about anger. It was about presence, assertion, and the careful unveiling of what had been overlooked. I would show them that respect and acknowledgement are not granted lightly. They are earned, remembered, and demanded when necessary. And I intended to demand mine with the subtle power I had honed over a lifetime. The conversation continued around me, the smiles and polite nods masking the tension that I alone seemed to sense. Every word she spoke was a test, every gesture a challenge, and I responded not with confrontation, but with silent observation. I cataloged each interaction, each misstep, and each opportunity to remind them of the truth. The evening was a chessboard, and I was ready to move with precision. By the time the house settled into a quiet lull, I had already planned my course of action. The daughter-in-law might have believed she held all the power, but she did not account for the depth of my knowledge, the years of preparation, and the unshakable presence of truth. Tonight, the first pieces of the silent reclamation would be set into place. I would not shout. I would not plead. I would simply reveal, step by step, the reality they had ignored. And in that revelation, my children would finally see me, not as a shadow, but as the woman who had shaped their lives, preserved their legacy, and refused to be forgotten. As I finally retired to my room for a brief moment of reflection, I allowed myself a deep, steady breath. The fight was beginning, and I was ready. For the first time in years, the weight of invisibility began to lift. My voice, though quiet, was about to speak louder than any words they had ever heard. The night stretched ahead, full of tension and potential, and I welcomed it with the calm certainty of someone who has waited long enough. The time had come to be seen. I often think back to the years when the house felt alive with laughter, chatter, and the kind of warmth only a family bound by love and trust can share. Those early mornings when I would rise before the sun to prepare breakfast, or the nights spent mending clothes and listening to the small worries of my children, felt like the invisible threads that wove us together. I never thought those threads could be unraveled by a single new presence, yet here we were, standing on the precipice of quiet betrayal. From the very beginning, I had devoted myself to building a home where my children could flourish. Every birthday meticulously planned, every scraped knee soothed with patience, every achievement quietly celebrated was part of a life I had given to them. I had watched them grow, witnessing milestones with pride and quiet satisfaction. Their triumphs became mine, their failures mine to guide. I thought that love and dedication were enough to guarantee their recognition and respect. But I learned too late that influence could be steered and loyalty could be persuaded by a voice other than mine. Her arrival in our lives was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable. She was polite, charming, and careful to present herself as someone who shared my values. My children, trusting and young, welcomed her with open arms, never suspecting the quiet encroachment that was to come. At first, I tried to maintain harmony, thinking that perhaps I was misjudging her intentions. But then came the small incidents, a suggestion of mine dismissed in favor of hers, decisions made without my consultation, my words brushed aside in favor of her advice. The shift was incremental, almost imperceptible, until one day I realized the weight of her presence had replaced mine. It was in those moments that the first seeds of doubt and frustration took root within me. I found myself questioning my own memory, my judgment, and even my role in my own home. But the truth was undeniable. My children were listening to her, and my voice, once central to their decisions, was being marginalized. The realization stung more than I had anticipated. The betrayal did not manifest in shouting or overt malice. It was far subtler, more insidious. It came in nods, smiles, and polite agreements that excluded me, that made me feel unseen in a space I had nurtured for decades. I remember sitting alone in my bedroom one evening, staring at the family photographs that lined the walls. Images of birthdays, holidays, and ordinary days spent together reminded me of what had been and what was slipping away. I thought about all the sacrifices I had made, the times I had stayed silent to maintain peace, and the countless ways I had given of myself to ensure my children's happiness. And yet, in the present, those very efforts were being overshadowed by manipulation and subtle coercion. That night, I began to understand the true extent of the challenge before me. It was not just about being heard, it was about reclaiming my place, my voice, and the recognition that had been quietly denied. I could no longer rely on patience alone. The quiet manipulations had to be addressed with strategy, intelligence, and careful observation. I began to make mental notes, cataloging every interaction, every moment where influence had shifted away from me, every subtle attempt to rewrite the story of our family. Looking back, I can see the pattern clearly now. The daughter-in-law had perfected the art of quiet persuasion, gaining loyalty without confrontation. She had studied my children, understood their weaknesses, and gently, almost imperceptibly, positioned herself as the authority figure they needed. My previous assumptions about love and trust, while genuine, had left me vulnerable. And yet, even in this realization, I found a spark of hope. If I had been patient, careful, and observant, I could turn the tide. The very qualities I had relied upon throughout my life, quiet strength, careful attention, and steadfast resolve, were the tools I would use to reclaim what was rightfully mine. I also reflected on the small victories and moments of resilience I had experienced over the years, the times when my children had sought my counsel in secret, the subtle acknowledgments that had gone unnoticed by others reminded me that the foundation of my influence was not entirely gone. It had merely been obscured, and that knowledge gave me courage. It was a reminder that my voice, though momentarily sidelined, still carried weight, and with strategy and timing, it could resonate once more. The next few weeks were a delicate balance of observation and preparation. I watched interactions closely, noting who spoke when, who listened, and who ignored. I began to identify the cracks in the facade of control she had built. Small gestures of doubt, fleeting glances, moments of hesitation, all became important signals. I realized that influence, once thought permanent, could shift if approached carefully. And I would approach it, not with anger, but with precision and patience. As I prepared myself mentally for the confrontation that would inevitably come, I felt a mixture of anticipation and resolve. The journey had been long, filled with subtle betrayals and overlooked sacrifices, but it was far from over. My children might not yet see the truth, but they would. And when that moment arrived, they would understand not just the mistakes they had made, but the depth of the life, love, and quiet strength that had sustained our family through years of challenge and change. By the end of the night, as the house settled into quiet slumber, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead was clear: reclaim my voice, assert my place, and reveal the truths that had been hidden in plain sight. My journey was just beginning, and this time it would be guided by the steady hand of patience, the sharp eye of observation, and the unwavering heart of a mother determined to be seen. The tension grew with each passing day, subtle but undeniable. The daughter-in-law seemed to sense my quiet scrutiny and adjusted her tactics accordingly. Every conversation was carefully orchestrated, every comment calculated to reinforce her control over my children. My children, still blinded by loyalty and affection, seemed oblivious to the growing divide, responding politely to her words while overlooking mine. It was exhausting to witness, but I reminded myself that observation was my weapon now, not confrontation. One evening, as we gathered for dinner, I noticed the small signs that had become impossible to ignore. The way my daughter-in-law leaned closer to my children, whispering suggestions that seemed innocent but guided decisions in her favor. The slight hesitations when my children glanced toward me, as if weighing my words against hers and consistently choosing her version. Every nod and smile that ignored my input became a brick in the wall she had built between us. I felt the familiar pang of hurt, but this time it was accompanied by a rising determination. I began to document everything, mentally noting the patterns of behavior and manipulation, the timing of her interjections, the choices my children made when influenced, and the subtle ways she minimized my presence. All of it was important. I realized that this was not a battle to be fought with anger or loud declarations. It was a game of patience, strategy, and careful timing. I had the truth on my side, and if I presented it thoughtfully, it would be impossible for anyone to ignore. The tension reached a subtle climax one afternoon when a discussion about the family finances arose. My daughter-in-law suggested reallocating certain responsibilities and resources in a way that clearly excluded me. My children nodded, trusting her guidance, and I felt a mix of disbelief and resolve. I did not interrupt immediately. Instead, I allowed the conversation to unfold, quietly observing, cataloging every word and gesture. I understood that reacting impulsively would play into her hands. My moment would come, and it would be deliberate. I also began to notice cracks in their certainty. My children occasionally exchanged glances, brief hesitations betraying their confidence in her. These moments were fleeting, but they revealed that the influence was not as absolute as it seemed. I held on to these glimpses of doubt, knowing that small openings could become decisive when leveraged correctly. Each day of careful observation strengthened my understanding of the situation, and I began formulating a plan that would reveal the truth without causing unnecessary conflict. One afternoon, I found myself alone in the study, reviewing letters and documents that had been tucked away over the years. They contained evidence of my contributions, guidance, and decisions that had shaped the family's stability. The weight of what I had accomplished contrasted sharply with the present, where my children seemed willing to overlook my role. But as I read through the words I had written, the decisions I had made, and the legacy I had built, I felt a renewed sense of power. The truth was on my side, and it would speak louder than any persuasion or charm. The days that followed became a careful dance. I engaged in conversation selectively, allowing my children to encounter subtle contradictions in the narratives they had been fed. I asked questions that prompted reflection, shared memories that reminded them of my presence and contributions, and maintained a composed demeanor that contrasted sharply with her performative authority. It was exhausting work, requiring patience, restraint, and keen attention to detail, but every small victory built toward a larger goal. By the time the first signs of acknowledgement began to appear, I had already begun to subtly guide my children toward seeing the truth. A question here, a recollection there, gently nudging their awareness without direct confrontation. It was a slow and careful process, but I knew that patience would yield far greater results than rash declarations. The balance of power was shifting imperceptibly, and I could sense the moment when my presence would be fully recognized approaching. That evening, as the house settled into a quiet rhythm, I reflected on the subtle victories of the day. My daughter-in-law's attempts to dominate were not failing entirely, but they were no longer absolute. The foundation of truth, built through years of observation, patience, and careful action, was beginning to crack her control. I felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the moment of confrontation would not need theatrics or anger. It would be the undeniable weight of reality that restored balance and respect. The stage was set, and the pieces were moving into place. The day I found the papers, the house smelled like rain and lemon polish. I had been cleaning the bookshelf in the study, the one by the window where sunlight pooled in the afternoons, when my hand brushed against an envelope tucked behind a framed photograph. It was heavier than I expected, its edges worn from being handled in secret. I did not hesitate. I slipped my thumb beneath the flap and unfolded years of careful omission. Inside were notes, receipts, and a faded document I recognized at once. It was a letter from my late husband, dated years before his passing, in which he had spelled out certain wishes about the house and the care of the family. He had written with the deliberate, steady hand I remembered so well. The letter did not name every detail, but it left a clear thread of responsibility and respect that could not be ignored. There were also bank notices and correspondence that showed decisions made while I thought we had been acting together. Someone had quietly rerouted conversations and agreements, and it had been done without my knowledge. My first feeling was anger, sharp and electric, but it was quickly followed by a calm I had learned over a lifetime. This was proof, plain and simple, proof that my voice in our shared decisions had been manipulated, altered, and in some cases erased. I pressed the papers to my chest and felt the truth settle into me like warm coals. The evidence did not shout. It simply existed with the quiet authority that facts always carry. I did not act rashly. Instead, I placed the envelope in my bag and went to the neighbor I had known for decades. Mrs. Alvarez had been a friend since my children were small. She was practical, honest, and had a son who was a notary. I needed someone steady, someone who would help me interpret the documents without emotion clouding the facts. She welcomed me with a cup of tea and a steady look that said we would handle this together. We sat at her kitchen table with the rain tapping against the windows and spread the papers between us. Mrs. Alvarez read each line carefully, her brow furrowing at certain signatures and dates. She pointed out a series of notes that suggested a pattern of exclusion. There were meeting requests I had never received and signed acknowledgments that bore my name but not my consent. One document in particular was troubling. It was a revised household agreement that redistributed responsibilities and assets. My signature appeared on a page that I did not remember signing. The ink was faded, and the handwriting was not mine. I felt my throat tighten, but I remained composed. This was why I had waited. This was why I had observed and collected details. The evidence was starting to form a map, and the map led away from the narrative that had been fed to my children. Mrs. Alvarez suggested we speak to her son, the notary, and to a lawyer she trusted. She promised discretion and help. In that moment, I was grateful not just for the documents, but for the allies I had cultivated over the years. The notary confirmed what I had suspected. The signature on the revised agreement had been manipulated in a manner that suggested coercion and substitution. The lawyer, a woman with steady eyes and a careful manner, explained the legal avenues available. She did not promise drama or public humiliation. She spoke instead of clarity, of formal requests for records, and of the gentle and firm presentation of evidence that would make it impossible to deny the truth. Her words were pragmatic and precise, exactly the tone I wanted for what came next. We made a plan that relied on calm procedure and the undeniable weight of documents. First, we would request official copies of any agreements, meeting minutes, and financial transfers that involved the household over the past 5 years. Second, we would prepare a statement that outlined the discrepancies and the timeline of how decisions had been altered without my knowledge. Third, we would arrange a mediated meeting with a neutral third party present. The goal was not to shame, but to show, to let the facts speak in a setting where emotion would not rewrite the record. As we worked, I thought about the daughter-in-law and the careful way she had built her influence. She had relied on charm, on selective memory, and on the willingness of my children to accept the easiest narrative. She had not, however, accounted for the quiet persistence of truth. She had not considered that I kept receipts, letters, and the shaped memories of a life lived in service to my family. She had underestimated the fact that some things are preserved not by loud protest, but by careful stewardship. When I returned home that evening with a thin folder of copies and a calm plan, I practiced my words quietly in the mirror. I did not want to sound accusatory. I wanted to sound factual, confident, and composed. The lawyer had advised brief, clear statements and evidence presented in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. I told myself that dignity would be my armor and precision my companion. The night before the meeting, I arranged the photographs on the mantel in a way that reminded me of who we had been. I placed the letter from my husband in a frame on the shelf where I could see it each morning. I slept with a steady calm that felt like readiness. I was not preparing for battle. I was preparing to make visible what had been invisible for far too long. On the morning of the meeting, the house was still and bright. I dressed in a simple blouse that my husband had always liked and smoothed my hands until I felt ready. The notary and the lawyer arrived on time. We met in the living room, a space that had held so many memories and so much history. My children were called and informed that we would be discussing household matters with a neutral party present. I did not need to demand attention. I simply invited them to witness the facts. As they entered the room, I noticed their expressions. There was a polite confusion, a hint of defensiveness I had seen before, and a small, telling hesitation that suggested a crack in their certainty. The daughter-in-law smiled, poised as ever, confident that she had orchestrated everything to her advantage. She did not expect the calm, methodical presentation that followed. We began with the basics. The notary explained the documents and the dates. The lawyer outlined the discrepancies and the steps we had taken to verify the records. I spoke only when asked, and when I did, I read from the letter my husband had written. I watched their faces as the words landed, as memories were stirred, and as the quiet truth began to x-ray the narrative they had been told. The evidence did the work I could not have done with pleading or anger. By the time we finished, the room felt altered. The daughter-in-law no longer had the unchallenged stage she had claimed. The pieces of the story had been rearranged into a more honest pattern. My children looked at me with a mixture of apology and stunned realization. It was not a dramatic turning of heads, but a soft, undeniable shift. Truth, presented calmly and with fact, had a way of correcting the course that charm and persuasion had skewed. I did not celebrate then or later with grand gestures. My satisfaction was quiet and steady. The plan had worked not because it humiliated anyone, but because it restored clarity. I had not sought to punish. I had sought to be seen. And for the first time in years, I felt that my presence was acknowledged in a way that could not be easily dismissed. The turning point had arrived, not with fireworks, but with the slow, measured certainty of evidence laid bare. The day of the meeting felt like stepping into sunlight after a long winter. I had arranged the documents in a neat folder, every page in order, each note and letter a small pillar supporting the truth. The lawyer sat beside me with a calm I admired, the notary at her end with his stamp ready. We had invited a mediator, a woman respected for her fairness, so that the conversation would remain focused on facts and not become a battlefield of emotion. My children entered the room with polite faces that did not yet reveal the full weight of what they were about to hear. The daughter-in-law sat with the same poised smile that had carried her through so many family gatherings. She did not appear rattled. I understood then that charm breeds confidence, and confidence can be hard to shake. But I had documents, witnesses, and a quiet steadiness that charm could not falsify. We began with the letter from my husband. I read his words aloud, slowly and clearly, so that the room could not mishear what had been said years before. He wrote of responsibilities and respect, of a home meant to shelter and nurture the family he loved. His handwriting was familiar and steady, and as his voice echoed in the room, I saw the first flicker of uncertainty cross my children's faces. The daughter-in-law smiled less easily now, and her hands, previously so composed, tightened around her cup. Next, the notary presented the discrepancies. He compared dates, signatures, and meeting notices. The revised household agreement was examined line by line. There were pages where my name appeared in faded ink, but upon close inspection, the tracings and pen pressure did not match my handwriting. The notary explained what to look for, pointing out the subtle differences that happen when a signature is copied or coerced. My children leaned forward, the room silent but for the notary's voice and the occasional intake of breath. The lawyer then outlined the financial reroutings. Transfers had been authorized in ways that excluded me. There were meeting minutes I had never been sent and decisions documented without my consent. Each point was presented calm and factual, without accusation. The mediator asked clarifying questions, and the daughter-in-law answered, her voice steady but tentative. When asked about certain dates and signatures, she faltered, offering explanations that sounded rehearsed and thin under scrutiny. My children leaned forward, the room silent but for the notary's voice and the occasional intake of breath. The lawyer then outlined the financial reroutings. Transfers had been authorized in ways that excluded me. There were meeting minutes I had never been sent and decisions documented without my consent. Each point was presented calm and factual, without accusation. The mediator asked clarifying questions, and the daughter-in-law answered, her voice steady but tentative. When asked about certain dates and signatures, she faltered, offering explanations that sounded rehearsed and thin under scrutiny. I watched my children as the facts landed. It was not a single moment of revelation, but rather a slow unfolding, like a curtain being drawn back to reveal the stage. They exchanged looks, small, private, and charged with dawning comprehension. The son, who had always been quick to defend her, shifted in his chair, his jaw tight, his eyes darting between the documents and my face. The daughter looked downward, fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve, as if the material truth unsettled an emotional certainty she had not questioned before. When the notary demonstrated the forgery, the room held its breath. He showed an original document beside the altered one, the differences in ink and pressure clear to anyone who looked closely. The mediator asked if anyone could explain how such an alteration had occurred. The daughter-in-law offered a narrative about paperwork mishaps and misunderstandings, but the timeline did not line up with the records. Her confidence waned as each factual gap widened. I felt no triumph in that moment. What I felt was the relief of being known. The evidence had done what my pleas never could. It had created a space for my children to see, with undeniable clarity, how influence had been manipulated and how decisions had been redirected without my knowledge. I spoke then, not to accuse, but to remind them of what we had built together. I told them, in simple sentences, of the nights I had stayed awake worrying over bills, the mornings I had risen early to make sure they had everything they needed, the little choices that had added up to a life of care. My voice was steady. There was no anger to distract from the facts. The daughter-in-law, confronted with the weight of evidence, began to shift her posture. Her explanations grew thinner and then fell away. She had relied on charm to steer choices, but charm had no bearing on signatures or bank transfers. The notary suggested correcting the official records, and the lawyer recommended a formal acknowledgement of the discrepancies with an agreement to restore any misallocated responsibilities. It was not vengeance, it was correction. My children listened as the mediator presented options for restitution and clarity. The proposals included formal corrections to household agreements, temporary oversight of financial transfers until transparency was restored, and a written statement acknowledging the errors. These were pragmatic steps toward repairing trust, not dramatic punishments. The son sat back, his face pale with the realization of his mistake. He apologized quietly, voice thick, as if the apology had been formed only after the facts made it necessary. The daughter offered a trembling apology as well, her eyes wet with repentance. She spoke of confusion and misplaced trust, of the difficulty of seeing manipulation when it was wrapped in kindness. It was a humble, human admission that carried the weight of regret. The daughter-in-law's response was quieter, less assured. She did not offer a grand admission. Instead, she promised to cooperate in correcting the records and to step back from unilateral decision-making. Whether her promise would hold remained to be seen, but the formal steps in the mediator's plan offered safeguards that could not be easily ignored. The room felt changed when we concluded. The mechanisms of unfair advantage had been exposed and constrained. The notary and the lawyer left with copies of corrected documents to be filed, and the mediator offered follow-up sessions to ensure the process remained fair and transparent. My children remained a while after the professionals left, sitting close enough to touch but quiet, as if gathering scattered pieces of understanding that had just fallen into place. I did not demand elaborate apologies or public scenes. What mattered to me was the restoration of truth and the reestablishment of boundaries that honored the life I had given. The measures we had put in place would protect that life, and the presence of official records and agreements meant the narrative could not be easily rewritten. I felt a quiet gratitude for the law, for good neighbors, and for the patience that had guided me to this point. As the day closed, my children held my hands and spoke with a sincerity that felt new. They asked questions I had wished they would have asked years ago. They listened as I answered, and in their listening, I detected an eagerness to rebuild what had been strained. The daughter-in-law offered a soft, uncertain look and a promise to change. The future was uncertain, but the foundation for honest interaction had been relaid. I slept that night with a calm that felt more like healing than victory. The work of restoration would take time, and trust would need to be rebuilt through steady, small actions. But the truth had been revealed, and in that revelation, my place in the family was acknowledged once more. Justice, in its quiet and deliberate form, had been served. I had not needed to raise my voice to be heard. The documents and the calm presentation of facts had done what decades of pleading had not. I had been seen, and that sight was enough to begin mending what had been broken. The days after the meeting were quieter, but quieter in a way that felt honest rather than hollow. There were no parades or grand announcements, only small gestures that stacked into something resembling repair. My children began to ask questions again, not the kind that assumed I would always agree, but the kind that sought my counsel. They listened with more focus, pausing to let my words settle. Those pauses were small victories, each one a soft reclamation of space and authority that had been taken for granted. We established new routines that honored transparency. Financial matters that had once been whispered about in corners were discussed openly at the kitchen table. Decisions that had been made behind closed doors were now recorded and shared. It was a change that required humility from everyone, including me. I had to accept that forgiveness would take time and that trust would need to be rebuilt one honest act at a time. That was a price I was willing to pay because what mattered most was the health of our relationship and the dignity of our shared life. The daughter-in-law kept her promise in small ways at first. She began to defer to the documents we had corrected, and she invited discussion rather than dictating decisions. Whether this change was sincere or strategic, I could not say yet, but the formal boundaries we had set made it harder for manipulation to take hold again. I slept that night with a calm that felt more like healing than victory. The work of restoration would take time, and trust would need to be rebuilt through steady, small actions. But the truth had been revealed, and in that revelation, my place in the family was acknowledged once more. Justice, in its quiet and deliberate form, had been served. I had not needed to raise my voice to be heard. The documents and the calm presentation of facts had done what decades of pleading had not. I had been seen, and that sight was enough to begin mending what had been broken. The days after the meeting were quieter, but quieter in a way that felt honest rather than hollow. There were no parades or grand announcements, only small gestures that stacked into something resembling repair. My children began to ask questions again, not the kind that assumed I would always agree, but the kind that sought my counsel. They listened with more focus, pausing to let my words settle. Those pauses were small victories, each one a soft reclamation of space and authority that had been taken for granted. We established new routines that honored transparency. Financial matters that had once been whispered about in corners were discussed openly at the kitchen table. Decisions that had been made behind closed doors were now recorded and shared. It was a change that required humility from everyone, including me. I had to accept that forgiveness would take time and that trust would need to be rebuilt one honest act at a time. That was a price I was willing to pay because what mattered most was the health of our relationships and the dignity of our shared life. The daughter-in-law kept her promise in small ways at first. She began to defer to the documents we had corrected, and she invited discussion rather than dictating decisions. Whether this change was sincere or strategic, I could not say yet, but the formal boundaries we had set made it harder for manipulation to take hold again. I slept that night with a calm that felt more like healing than victory. The work of restoration would take time, and trust would need to be rebuilt through steady, small actions. But the truth had been revealed, and in that revelation, my place in the family was acknowledged once more. Justice, in its quiet and deliberate form, had been served. I had not needed to raise my voice to be heard. The documents and the calm presentation of facts had done what decades of pleading had not. I had been seen, and that sight was enough to begin mending what had been broken. The days after the meeting were quieter, but quieter in a way that felt honest rather than hollow. There were no parades or grand announcements, only small gestures that stacked into something resembling repair. My children began to ask questions again, not the kind that assumed I would always agree, but the kind that sought my counsel. They listened with more focus, pausing to let my words settle. Those pauses were small victories, each one a soft reclamation of space and authority that had been taken for granted. We established new routines that honor transparency. Financial matters that had once been whispered about in corners were discussed openly at the kitchen table. Decisions that had been made behind closed doors were now recorded and shared. It was a change that required humility from everyone, including me. I had to accept that forgiveness would take time and that trust would need to be rebuilt one honest act at a time. That was a price I was willing to pay because what mattered most was the health of our relationships and the dignity of our shared life. The daughter-in-law kept her promise in small ways at first. She began to defer to the documents we had corrected, and she invited discussion rather than dictating decisions. Whether this change was sincere or strategic, I could not say yet, but the formal boundaries we had set made it harder for manipulation to take hold again. I watched her with measured curiosity and refused to rush into judgment. Healing takes both time and patience, and people reveal themselves with action more than with words. My children apologized in ways that felt genuine. There were conversations late at night where they confessed their confusion and admitted how easily they had been swayed by charm. They spoke of guilt and regret, and they asked how to make amends in ways that did not try to erase the pain, but addressed it honestly. I accepted their apologies because the truth had been shown, and because their willingness to face their mistake mattered more than any theatrical apology. We made plans to rebuild trust, starting with small shared tasks and ending with promises of openness. The house itself seemed to breathe more easily. I rearranged a few photographs on the mantel, not to assert dominance, but to remind myself of the life we had built. Morning light fell across the living room in a way that made every framed memory look new. I found myself lingering over cups of tea with my children, sharing stories of the past and laughing over memories that had nothing to do with the conflict. Those ordinary moments stitched us back together more effectively than any formal meeting. There were also private reckonings I had to face. I thought often about the years I had given to my family and the times I had chosen silence over conflict in order to keep peace. I did not regret those choices, but I recognized that peace obtained through erasure was no peace at all. I vowed to myself that I would not retreat into the same pattern. My voice would be present, steady, and respected. I would not permit the comforts of silence to be mistaken for consent. Neighbors who had watched our family from the edges offered quiet support. Mrs. Alvarez would drop by with a loaf of bread and a knowing smile. The notary sent a brief note acknowledging that the corrections had been filed. The lawyer checked in to make sure the mediation was proceeding as planned. These small acts of solidarity reminded me that a community can be a quiet force for justice and restoration when the appropriate systems are engaged. My relationship with the daughter-in-law became more complex than I had imagined. She was not a cartoon villain, but a person who had found advantage in a certain pattern of behavior. I watched her with a blend of caution and compassion. There were moments when she seemed genuinely regretful and times when old habits tempted her. We both navigated the terrain of new boundaries, learning how to coexist with dignity and respect. It was not easy, and it would not be perfect, but the framework we established reduced the likelihood of future betrayal. I also thought about the legacy I wanted to leave beyond property and documents. The lesson I wanted my children and grandchildren to learn was not simply that truth matters, but that dignity and patience have their own power. I wanted them to remember that strength is not always loud, and that decisions made with integrity often require waiting, observation, and the courage to act when the moment is right. I wanted them to honor the quiet stewardship that builds a home over decades. As weeks turned into months, the household settled into a rhythm that felt more balanced. Transparency became habit, and our conversations grew richer for it. My children consulted me on matters large and small, and I offered guidance grounded in experience rather than resentment. We learned to disagree without diminishing one another, and that change felt like growth more than punishment. Sometimes I would wake early and sit by the window with the kettle on, watching the neighborhood awake. The world outside moved on with its usual pace, indifferent to the dramas and reconciliations inside our walls. Yet those morning moments were precious to me, a time to reflect on what had been and what still could be. I felt gratitude for the opportunity to reclaim not just a place in a house, but a place in a story that was still being written. One afternoon, my youngest grandchild climbed into my lap and asked a simple question about a photograph on the wall. As I told a story about the day it was taken, I realized that the most enduring part of my legacy was not a title or a deed, but the memories and the way I had loved. The restitution we had sought had restored more than legal clarity. It had restored the lines of connection that made a family a family. In quiet moments, I would repeat a line to myself, not as a boast, but as a reminder. I had refused to become small in my own story. That refusal had been the work of years, expressed in patience, careful observation, and the deliberate application of truth. It was a practice of dignity that I hoped would ripple through the lives of my children and grandchildren. Life, of course, continued with its ordinary challenges and joys. There would be arguments and misunderstandings in the future, and there would be days when old patterns tried to reassert themselves. But the foundation had shifted toward honesty and mutual respect, and that shift felt irreversible enough to allow for real healing. I walked through my home with a lighter step, often pausing to look at a photograph, a letter, or a small memento that reminded me of what we had endured and what we had rebuilt. When visitors asked how I had handled such a delicate and painful situation, I would tell them simply that truth, presented calmly and with evidence, has a way of settling things. I would tell them that patience and preparation are allies to those who have been marginalized. I would tell them to keep their memories safe and their documents closer still. Most of all, I would tell them to refuse to become small in their own stories, because every life deserves to be seen and honored.